Try something for a second. Stand up, if you can, and lift one foot off the ground. Don't do anything fancy. Just balance there for 10 seconds. Notice everything that happened. Your ankle made tiny adjustments you didn't order. Your hip shifted a fraction of an inch. Your eyes, without you telling them to, locked onto a fixed point across the room. If you started to tip, something corrected it before you were even consciously aware you were tipping. That's the thing people get wrong about balance. They think of it the way they think of eye color or height, something you either have or you don't, handed to you at birth, fixed for life. She's always been graceful. He's just clumsy, as if balance were a trait, like being tall. It's not a trait, it's a system. And that difference matters more than almost anything else in this conversation, because traits can't be trained, but systems can. So let's take the system apart and look at the pieces, because once you see how it's built, everything else about why it breaks down and how to fix it falls out naturally. Piece 1 lives inside your ear in a structure smaller than a pea called the vestibular system. Picture a tiny house of curved tubes filled with fluid, with microscopic hairs lining the walls. When you tilt or turn your head, the fluid lags behind for a fraction of a second. Inertia. And that lag bends the hairs. The bent hairs fire a signal the head just moved this way, this fast. It's essentially a biological version of the level a carpenter uses to check if a shelf is straight, except this one updates constantly, in real time, as you move through the world. Piece 2 is your eyes. You already know eyes let you see obstacles. The curb, the dog, the wet patch on the floor. But they're doing a second job at the same time, one most people never think about. They're reading the horizon. The line where the wall meets the ceiling, the edge of a door frame, the horizon out a window. Your visual system uses these fixed reference lines to constantly answer the question, am I still upright relative to the world around me? Take away good lighting, or put someone in a room with no clear vertical lines, and you'll see this system falter immediately, even in someone young and healthy. Piece 3 is the one almost nobody credits: your feet, ankles, and knees. Buried in the skin and joints down, there are pressure sensors, constantly reporting back. More weight on the left heel, less on the right toe. The ground just got softer, the ground just tilted. This is called proprioception, and it's arguably the fastest of the three systems because it doesn't need to interpret anything abstract like a horizon line. It's just reading direct physical contact with the ground. Here's the part that makes this a system rather than three separate senses. Your brain, specifically a region tucked at the base of your skull called the cerebellum, takes all three reports and checks them against each other dozens of times per second. If the inner ear says, "You're tilting right," and the feet say, "More pressure on the right foot," and the eyes confirm the horizon is sliding, the brain trusts it and fires a correction to the muscles before you're even aware anything happened. This entire loop, sensing to correction, happens faster than you can consciously think the words, "I'm falling." Why does this matter so much? Because it means balance was never something you were simply born with and will simply lose, the way you might lose your natural hair color. It's closer to a skill built from infrastructure. Three sensing systems, one integrating brain region, and a feedback loop connecting them to your muscles. Infrastructure can rust from disuse. Infrastructure can also be maintained deliberately, the same way you'd maintain the wiring in an old house, not by hoping it holds, but by testing it and using it on purpose. This reframing is the whole foundation for everything else in this talk. If balance were a fixed gift, there'd be nothing to do about its decline except accept it. But because it's a system, three inputs, one processor, constant checking, it follows the same rule every system follows: use the parts together regularly, and the coordination between them stays sharp. Stop using them together, and the coordination, not the parts themselves, the coordination is what quietly erodes first. That's the crack in the foundation this whole decade opens up. And it's exactly where we're headed next. Let's go back to that three-part system, The inner ear, the eyes, the feet, all reporting to the brain, all being cross-checked dozens of times a second. Now here's a question worth sitting with. If you had to guess, which one of those three would you expect to fail first as people age? The ears, the eyes, the feet. It's a trick question. And the trick is the entire reason this particular decade, 65 to 75, feels like such a strange, disorienting stretch of life. The answer isn't one of them. The answer is a little bit of all three on roughly the same schedule. Think about what that actually means for the system we described. A three-input system is designed to be resilient precisely because it has redundancy. If your eyesight is bad one day, say you walk into a dim room, your inner ear and your feet can pick up the slack. If your ankle is sore, your eyes and inner ear compensate. The whole point of having three sources instead of one is that no single failure should be able to take the system down. But redundancy only protects you when the failures are staggered. It stops protecting you when the failures start arriving together. And that's exactly the biological trap of this decade. Not one system breaking, but three good systems quietly losing a bit of sharpness in the same 10-year window, so the redundancy that used to save you stops being available. Let's look at what's actually happening to each one. In the inner ear, the hair cells that detect fluid movement, the ones we compared to a carpenter's level, begin to drop in number and sensitivity. It's a slow attrition, similar to how you might lose a bit of hearing over decades without ever noticing a single moment where it happened. The result isn't that the inner ear stops working. It's that its signal gets a little noisier, a little less crisp, especially during quick movements, a fast head turn, a quick step to catch yourself. In the eyes, several things erode together, contrast sensitivity drops, so the eye has a harder time distinguishing a shadowed stair edge from the step above it. Depth perception softens slightly. The eyes also become slower to adjust between light and dark. Walk from a sunny porch into a dim hallway, and there's now a longer window where the visual system simply isn't giving reliable information. That's a gap that used to be milliseconds and is now a real, measurable pause. And in the feet, the nerve endings responsible for proprioception, that pressure-sensing report from the ground, conduct signals more slowly. This is a well-documented, ordinary part of nerve aging, not a disease. But remember, this whole system depends on speed. The loop from sensing to correction has to beat gravity. A signal that arrives a fraction of a second late isn't a small inconvenience. In a system built on split-second cross-checking, a little late is functionally the same as wrong. So picture the brain sitting at the center of all this, doing what it's always done, comparing three reports and firing a correction. Except now, instead of three sharp, fast, high-confidence signals, it's getting three signals that are each slightly dimmer, slightly delayed, slightly noisier. No single one has failed, but the agreement between them, the thing the whole system actually depends on, gets shaky. That shakiness is what people describe as the wobble that seems to show up out of nowhere in their late 60s. It isn't out of nowhere. It's three quiet, independent, ordinary aging processes arriving on the same timeline. This is also why the decade feels uniquely disorienting compared to what came before. In your 50s, if one system dipped, the other two picked up the work invisibly, and you never even knew there was a wobble to correct. Nothing felt different. Then, in this window, the redundancy that was silently protecting you for years starts running out at the same time across all three channels. And suddenly balance feels unfamiliar, unreliable, almost like it belongs to someone else's body. Here's the important part, though, and it's worth holding on to before the fear sets in. None of these three changes, on their own, are severe. A slightly noisier inner ear signal, a slightly slower visual adjustment, a slightly delayed foot pressure report. Individually, these are minor. It's only the stacking, the simultaneous timing, that creates the wobble. Which means the fix was never going to be about repairing one broken part. It was always going to be about giving the brain enough practice to re-sharpen the coordination between three parts that are each doing just fine on their own. just no longer perfectly in sync. Here's a question that trips people up every time. If someone told you they could get strong arms by lifting heavy weights 3 times a week, that would make sense to you immediately. Strength banks. You do the work, the muscle fibers thicken, and that thickening sits there, mostly intact, even on the days you don't train. That's how most people assume all physical capacities work. You build it up, and it stays built. Balance doesn't work that way. And once you see why, the just 5 minutes a day advice stops sounding like a lazy shortcut and starts looking like the only approach that actually matches how the system is built. Go back to what balance actually is: 3 input channels: inner ear, eyes, feet, reporting constantly to the brain, which cross-checks them dozens of times a second and fires tiny corrections. Now here's the key insight. That cross-checking isn't a fixed capacity, like the size of a muscle. It's closer to a calibration, the way a set of measuring instruments needs to be checked against each other regularly, or they slowly drift out of agreement even though nothing is physically broken. Think about a piano. If you learn a piece and then don't touch the instrument for 6 months, your fingers don't remember the piece the way your biceps remember how to lift a heavy box. The skill isn't stored the way muscle is stored. It has to be refreshed because it's not a size, it's a coordination, a constantly renegotiated agreement between many moving parts. Balance is much closer to the piano than the bicep. This is why doctors and physical therapists increasingly emphasize daily, short sessions over occasional long ones. It's not that a 45-minute balance workout once a week is useless. It's that it's solving the wrong kind of problem. A once-a-week session is treating balance like a muscle you can load up and bank. But the brain's cross-checking between the ear, the eyes, and the feet degrades on a daily rhythm, not a weekly one. Skip a week, and the coordination has already started drifting. A once-a-week session is essentially recalibrating the instruments once, then letting them drift for 6 days before touching them again. 5 minutes a day, by contrast, matches the actual biology. It's not about accumulating enough total minutes to hit some threshold. It's about frequency. Every single day, you're forcing the brain to run its comparison loop under a bit of controlled stress, standing on one foot so the feet's pressure reports become the dominant signal, and the brain has to lean on them harder than usual. Walking heel to toe so the base and support narrows and small wobbles have to be caught in real time. Turning the head slowly while walking so the eyes and inner ear have to renegotiate together instead of quietly agreeing on autopilot. None of these exercises are hard in the way lifting a heavy weight is hard. They're not building bigger muscles. They're rehearsals. Small, deliberate moments where the system is nudged slightly off balance on purpose, so the brain has to practice catching it. And because the underlying problem in this decade isn't that any one part is broken, but that the 3 parts have drifted out of sync, the fix isn't more strength. It's more rehearsal, more often, in small doses. There's also a quieter benefit to the 5-minute framing that's worth naming directly. It's short enough that people actually do it. A skill that needs daily repetition to stay sharp is only useful if the daily commitment is realistic. Ask someone to do a 45-minute balance regimen, and most people will do it twice, feel virtuous, and then quietly stop within 3 weeks. Which, given everything we just said about calibration drifting quickly without practice, is close to worthless. Ask someone to do 5 minutes, standing near a kitchen counter while the coffee brews, and it actually survives contact with a real life. The size of the dose matters less than most people assume. The frequency is the active ingredient. So the advice isn't 5 minutes, because that's all you probably have time for, so it's better than nothing. It's 5 minutes, because that's roughly what it takes, done daily, to keep 3 semi-independent sensing systems talking to each other at full speed. And because balance, unlike a bank account, only holds the balance you keep making daily deposits into. Here's something that seems backward until you trace through the logic carefully. The single biggest predictor of whether someone in their late 60s or 70s will suffer a serious fall isn't how many falls they've already had. It's how afraid they've become of falling. That sounds like it should be the other way around. Shouldn't fear be a sensible, protective response to a real risk? But follow the chain of cause and effect closely, and you'll see why fear itself becomes the more dangerous variable. Picture the common scenario. Someone in this age range trips slightly on a rug edge or catches themselves on a counter after a wobble on the stairs. Nothing happens, no injury. But something in their mind shifts that day. They start moving through the world differently, walking more slowly, avoiding the stairs when they can, sitting down more often, skipping the walk they used to take around the block. This feels like wisdom. It feels like listening to your body. But go back to what we established about the balance system itself. It's not a fixed trait. It's 3 sensing channels, checked constantly by the brain, and like any system built on constant use, it depends on regular, varied input to stay sharp. The inner ear needs quick head turns to stay calibrated. The feet need to feel uneven ground, different textures, quick weight shifts. The eyes need practice tracking a moving environment at different speeds and distances. All of that input comes from one place moving through the world normally. So here's the trap. The instinctive response to a stumble, move less, be more careful, shrink the range of activity, doesn't protect the balance system. It starves it. Every day of reduced movement is a day the 3 input channels get less practice working together. The muscles responsible for fine, fast corrections weaken from disuse the way any unused muscle weakens. The inner ear gets less exposure to the quick, varied movements that keep its signal sharp. The whole system, deprived of its normal daily challenge, gets rustier, not because of age directly, but because of the response to the fear that age-related wobbling produced. And a rustier system is, of course, more likely to fail the next time it's actually tested, which means the next near fall becomes more likely, not less. That near fall deepens the fear. The fear produces more retreat. The retreat produces more rustiness. This is what clinicians call the fear-fall cycle. And once you see the mechanism, it's easy to understand why it's so much more dangerous than the original stumble that started it. The stumble was a single event. The fear-fall cycle is a self-reinforcing loop that gets worse every single day it's left unaddressed, and it can run for months or years without anyone, including the person living it, realizing that caution has quietly become the actual threat. There's a second layer to this worth naming because it compounds the physical piece, the psychological cost. People who retreat out of fear of falling often retreat socially too, skipping gatherings that involve walking on unfamiliar ground, avoiding travel, declining invitations that require stairs or uneven sidewalks. That isolation carries its own well-documented health costs entirely separate from balance. So the fear-fall cycle doesn't just erode the physical system. It can quietly shrink a person's entire life, one reasonable-sounding precaution at a time. This is why doctors increasingly fear itself as a measurable, addressable clinical target, not just an emotional reaction to be soothed, but a mechanical input into the very system we've been describing all along. The intervention isn't to talk someone out of being cautious in some abstract, motivational way. It's to interrupt the loop at its physical root, give the system small, safe, controlled doses of the exact kind of challenge it's been avoiding. A hand on the counter while standing on one foot. A supported walk on slightly uneven ground, deliberately reintroducing the quick head turns and weight shifts that daily caution had quietly eliminated. Done safely and gradually, this does 2 things at once. It directly rebuilds the coordination between the ear, eyes, and feet, and it also gives the person direct, repeated evidence that their body can handle more than the fear was telling them. That evidence, accumulated in small daily doses, is often what breaks the cycle more effectively than reassurance ever could. So the real lesson here cuts against the instinct almost everyone has. When the wobble first shows up in this decade, the impulse is to protect yourself by doing less. But the system doesn't need protection from movement. It needs more of it. just smaller, safer, and more deliberate than before. There's a quiet assumption baked into how most people talk about aging, and it's worth dragging out into the open because it shapes everything downstream from it. The assumption is this: the years between 65 and 75 are something you get through. You brace for them. You adapt to them. You accept a slow, one-way slide and try to manage the descent gracefully. Balance in this story is just one more thing that quietly leaves you, like the color in your hair, noticed after the fact, never really up for negotiation. Everything we've walked through tonight says that story is wrong, and wrong in a specific, correctable way. Go back to the very first idea: balance isn't a trait, it's a system. 3 sensing channels, cross-checked constantly by the brain. Then the second idea: this decade is hard not because one part breaks, but because all 3 parts lose little sharpness on the same timeline, so the redundancy that used to protect you quietly runs out. Then the third: because it's a coordination skill and not a stored strength, it responds to small, frequent practice rather than occasional large effort. And the fourth: the biggest threat isn't the wobble itself. It's the retreat the wobble triggers, which starves the very system that needed exercise. Put those 4 ideas together, and a very different picture of this decade emerges. Not a decline to be endured, but a system undergoing a specific, identifiable kind of drift, one that responds to specific, identifiable input. That's the definition of something trainable. You don't endure a piano skill going rusty. You practice it back into shape. The same logic applies here, and yet almost nobody frames it that way to people actually living through this age range. Why the silence then? Partly because the earlier decades of life never required this kind of deliberate attention. In your 30s and 40s, balance maintained itself as a side effect of ordinary life. Climbing stairs, carrying groceries, chasing a kid across a yard, walking briskly to catch a bus. Nobody needed a balance routine because daily life was already providing the input. So there was never a moment where anyone had to sit someone down and explain how the system worked, because the system was quietly taking care of itself. This decade is different precisely because the redundancy that used to cover for a sedentary afternoon has thinned out. The ordinary activities of daily life, which used to be enough, quietly stopped being enough, not because life changed, but because the margin for error shrank. And nobody sends a notice when the margin shrinks. There's no moment where a doctor's letter arrives saying, as of this year, casual movement will no longer be sufficient to maintain your balance system. Deliberate practice is now required. The transition is invisible until the wobble shows up, and by the time it shows up, most people interpret it through the old, incorrect story: this is just aging, there's nothing to be done, better be careful. That's the gap this whole talk has been trying to close. Not, here's a nice exercise you could try, but a more fundamental correction. This decade is not a passive slide, it's an active, correctable drift in a system that has always responded to how it's used. The 5 minutes a day isn't a lifestyle tip bolted onto an otherwise unstoppable decline. It's the direct, mechanical answer to a direct, mechanical problem. 3 sensing channels that need daily rehearsal to stay in sync at exactly the age when daily life stops automatically providing that rehearsal. There's actually something almost hopeful hiding in why this decade specifically is described as trainable, rather than every decade being equally so. The window exists because the system hasn't failed, it's drifted. Drift is reversible in a way that failure isn't. A hip that's broken from a fall is a different problem entirely, one with a much harder road back. But the wobble that shows up quietly in someone's late 60s, before any fall has happened, is exactly the kind of problem 3 input systems are built to recover from, given the right daily input. That's the actual window doctors are pointing to when they emphasize this specific decade. Not because it's uniquely dangerous, though it is genuinely a higher risk stretch, but because it's uniquely responsive, a stretch where small, consistent effort still produces outsized results, before any of these small losses harden into something that can't be trained back. So if there's one thing worth carrying out of this room tonight, it's the reframing itself. More than any single exercise, this isn't a decade to survive. It's a decade to actively maintain. And the system in question has been listening to how you use it every single day for your entire life. It's still listening now.